If the USA invaded Mexico, would anyone interfere to stop them? About 5 years ago, just outside of Chetumal, Mexico, I stopped at this roadside stand made of a BBQ cook oven, tarps, plastic chairs, and tables. They specialized in milanesa. While I was eating, I got into a conversation with an older woman about my travels. At one point, she asked me what I thought about the cartels and the drugs crossing the border. I told her it was unfortunate and that Mexico really needed to start doing something about it, or else, at some point in the near future, they might end up with an openly narco president. She listened, then said Americans think too much about the supply side and not enough about the demand. She went on to tell me that the US consumes more illicit drugs than any other country on earth. She said there must be a soul sickness in America, and that the real problem was the demand, and that even if every narco was killed or driven out of Mexico, the insatiable appetite for drugs would just be filled by some other place. I never forgot that. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, there's not a whole lot that other countries could do against the US. And unless they wanted to risk war, other countries would probably just stay out of it, choosing to look the other way. Not really sure how, but pretty sure us Brits would be roped into this. Europe may have some hurty words, but would not do shit. China and Russia may send some weapons and supplies to help the poor Mexicans. That's about all the help they would get. Nobody in their right mind would even think of getting in the way of the US and their trillion-dollar war machine. Mexicans. This whole thread is insane, Elmo. No, not one country would physically step in. Our allies would slap the USA on the hand and write us strongly worded letters. Our enemies would rattle their swords and maybe provide Mexico with funds or arms. We would chase the cartels into the jungles of Central and South America, creating a problem for those countries, and then creating a power vacuum for Mexico. We would eventually leave after creating a puppet government, and the cartels would come back, and everything would return the way it was. The answer should be the US Americans themselves. This question is actually stupid though. If the US invades for the purpose of acquiring more territory, then they are going to be acquiring a lot of bad humbers too, as Trump would say. If they are invading for the same purpose as the Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam invasions, they should expect more of the same. Yes, Mexico has an army. From a purely military perspective, using force, I think it'd probably take Canada and Brazil joining with Mexico to actually present a proper threat to the US, and that's mostly only because the US would then be fighting on two fronts. But it'd be a huge risk for Canada, as the US could effectively cut them off from the rest of the world if it went that route, while still having more than enough power to mount an attack south. And then Brazil might not enter the fight because the US is a much larger trade partner for Brazil, only falling behind China. Any other attempt to force the US to back down would almost certainly be economic trade in nature. Why would the US invade Mexico again? Likely not in any direct way. The US would certainly be sanctioned. Why would they invade Mexico? They are going to pay for Trump's wall. I would imagine the Mexicans would stop them. No. What do you mean by invade? We could militaristically decimate Mexico, and its cartels probably from mostly a great distance. But if you mean to occupy or do something similar to Afghanistan or Vietnam, then we would likely get caught in another decade-long war that never actually ends, because fighting a cartel is no different than fighting an insurgency. At that point, they are the same thing. Insurgent warfare is difficult because they don't wear conventional military uniforms and are difficult to differ from civilians, which tends to lead to catastrophic, brutal events because nobody knows who they can trust inside a zone where everybody wants to seemingly kill you. And many of the civilians will continue to support the cartel out of fear for their own lives and their families. If you speak out against them in a place they have control over, you're as good as dead because nobody else is going to speak up and join you at the barrel end of a gun. A lot of those people would fear the cartels more than the military invading force because they've lived and existed around them for decades. Interfere how? Political and diplomatic tools can be used, sure, but unlike Taiwan, Ukraine, or most other places, North America is quite distant for other nations to actively interfere without risking direct confrontation with the US. I don't think Mexico is worth going into a conflict with the US. There's really no reason to invade Mexico. An invasion implies our country entering theirs against their wishes. If the cartels are enough of an issue for the United States, a good statesman could convince the president of Mexico to a joint operation with our own military. And this is something we would want if we wanted success. Local support and intelligence to assist our forces. Going at it alone would just end up with our military at odds with not only the cartels, but the Mexican army and police. It would just increase the odds of our soldiers getting killed.